Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today, we continue our study of the second book of Kings, that is Melachim Bet, with chapter 21. We are rapidly hurtling towards the end of this book and the history which is leading up to the end of the kingdom of Judah. And we had just read of the tragic end of the kingdom and the leadership of Hezekiah, who had a chance to be the one who saved Judah, who saved Judah forever. But unfortunately, we're going to find today that, and as we saw last time, that Hezekiah ended in a tragic way due to his selfishness, his arrogance. He was unable to fully fulfill the role which he was set up for, which he almost achieved, bringing about full salvation. His son, unfortunately, seemed to have inherited only the bad aspects of his character. Notably, where we're about to read about the reign of Menasheh, we see Judah being thrown back into the depravity of idol worship and all of the moral failures and awful oppression and violence that results therein. We see that despite the fact that Yehuda kept on showing hope, every once in a while there was a king that would arise who would be for real, a king who would arise who would be a hope, a king that would arise who would say, well, maybe we could make it, maybe we can fulfill God's dream, the dream predicted by the prophets, a dream of redemption, the dream of bringing justice and righteousness and trumpeting that message throughout the world. However, they keep falling back into the same trap that begins with idol worship and ends with awful horror and awful moral failure. Interestingly, as I wanted to point out that the career of Menasheh reads very differently here in the book of Kings than in the book of Chronicles. But since we're studying the book of Kings presents it as all bad. The book of Chronicles presents Menasheh at the end of his life as having turned around, as having done some form of repentance, but it was, of course, too little too late after the terrible damage he had caused. So here we are. The people are worshiping God at the temple. The people have been led by Hezekiah to a renaissance in Torah study, and as we see in various places, we see in the book of Mishlei, we see how they were working on the wisdom of Solomon. We see how the corrupt leadership had been subdued and people were on the right path. But as soon as Hezekiah is gone and his son Menasheh takes over, he flips everything directly into the wrong direction. Ben Shtei Mesrei Shana Menasheh b'malcho. Menasheh became the king at age 12. V'chamishim v'chamesh shana malach b'Yerushalayim, and he ruled for 55 years. This was a point in time in the concurrent history where the Assyrian Empire was starting to falter. The Babylonian Empire was starting to gain, and the main fights were between Babylon and Assyria, leaving us somewhat of a vacuum for these smaller outlying kingdoms like Judah to thrive without the threat of attack from those other nations. Eventually, Babylon would conquer Assyria, and then Babylon would start turning its attention to expanding its empire, and eventually would come to try to subdue and eventually overtake Judah completely. But that's a little bit into the future at this point. But at this point, Menasheh has free reign without any major, empires ruling over him. So he ruled for 55 years. V'shem imo Cheftziva, and his mother's name was Cheftziva. An interesting name, meaning my desire is in her. It's a little bit crude sounding, the name. But this would have been, that was her name. Vayasara be'enei Adonai, and he did evil, he did bad in the eyes of God. Kituavot hagoyim, bad in such a way that like the abominations of the nations, asher horish Adonai mipnei bnei Yisrael. Those nations that God had dispossessed, had thrown out of the land of Israel before the people of Israel. And if you remember from the rhetoric, from the talk, from the book of Deuteronomy mostly, but we've had it several times in the books of the prophets, that the whole point of the dispossession of those nations and the establishment of the people of Israel within the land of Israel was in order to demonstrate that this type of worship, this type of life is abhorrent to God, the type that leads to oppression of the poor, the type that leads to things such as awful as human sacrifice, the necromancy and the magical ideas of trying to manipulate the gods and the arrogance that comes along with that. We've spoken about that numerous times over and over again, whereas a monotheist says and worships and understands that the world was created for us to act in a certain moral and ethical way. God created the world with a purpose. There's one God. The world has a unity of purpose. All of us are children of the same God. We all are are called upon to act with tzedek umishpat, justice and righteousness. We all are called upon to bring this message and teach this message to the entire world. And things such as manipulating God through magic and sorcery makes no sense. Well, the only way to, quote, manipulate God, so to speak, in order to achieve a better outcome is to be better, to act better, to do better, to live according to the laws which God gave us in the Torah. This is the contribution of ethical monotheism, which Menasheh was right now turning completely upside down. So Vayashav, he went back by even et habamot, and those altars that were scattered throughout the land that his father had destroyed and removed. His father Hezekiah was the first one who finally did that. Those bamot represent the idea that God is to be worshipped through sacrifice. God is to be worshipped through giving him animals and sacrifices which he doesn't need, which he doesn't want, rather than just coming to the singular place of the temple, Asher Ibad Hezekiah, that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. Vayokem mizbechos laBaal, and he established and built altars to Baal, with the old Canaanite god who we hadn't heard of in a while. I remember Achaz, the father of Hezekiah, who had turned his attention to the gods of the Assyrians because he wanted to kowtow to the Assyrian Empire. But now Menasheh, when he has free reign to do anything, instead of going to his own traditions, his own Jewish traditions, and talking about and worshiping the one and only God, he went backwards in time to the primitive gods of the Canaanites that had preceded the people of Israel, the people of Judah in this land. Vayas Asherah, and he built an Asherah, kasher asa Achav melech Yisrael, in the same way that Ahab, the king of Israel, did way back when, before the destruction of the northern kingdom, which eventually led to the destruction of the northern kingdom. Vayishtachu l'chol tzva hashamayim, and he bowed to all the hosts of the heavens. He bowed to the sun and the moon and the stars. Vayavodos, and he worshipped them. Uvana mizbechos beveis Adonai, and he ended up building altars within the temple of God. Asher amar Adonai b'Yerushalayim osim eshemi, that temple within which God said, "This is the only place where I'm going to place my name. This is where you come to worship." In that place itself, he went and built altars. Vayiven mizbechos. I just want to make a point here. The mizbechos, the altar, the one and only altar, according to Maimonides and many other Jewish thinkers who I've been quoting throughout these podcasts, understand that the elimination of the altars that were spread around and the idea that only in one place do we come to worship God, that idea, that concept is a process of weaning people from the idea that one worships God through sacrifices, and bringing them to understand that one worships God through coming together, through building a bond and a relationship with God and with one another, that God doesn't want us to, if he wanted sacrifices, then, as we said several chapters ago, as Rav Shakeh of the Assyrian Empire would say, then God should want sacrifices all over the place. But that's not what he wants. What he wants is our behavior, right? The building of the temple was a process of saying, no, only here could you bring sacrifices. The people still had that need and feeling that they needed to worship through sacrifice because that's all they knew, that's all they understood. However, the ultimate goal was to bring them together to that one place in order to be able to teach this one principle, this principle of monotheism, which leads one to the idea of ethical monotheism. Vayiven mizbechos, but Menasheh did the opposite. He built altars l'chol tzva hashamayim, to all of the hosts of the heavens, b'shtei chatzros beis Adonai, in the two chatzros, in the two courtyards of the house of God. Those two courtyards presumably referring to the Ezrat Kohanim, right? The location where the holier area and the outer area, the holier area, meaning within the holier part of the temple itself, meaning where the Mizbeach HaKetoret, the altar of the incense, and the menorah and the shulchan were standing, the table of the showbread, and outside in the Ezrat Yisrael, where the Mizbeach Hanachoshet, the large altar on which the animals were generally brought, in both of those places he placed these altars. Ve'aviret beno ba'esh, and he went so far as to sacrificing his own son in the fire. V'onein v'nichesh v'asa'o v'yidonim, and he practiced all these magical practices of soothsaying and divination and necromancy and the consultation of spirits and who knows what and so on. Here, Balaso Sarah be'inei Adonai lachis, he did terrible things in the art of God in order, and lachis could be translated in order to make God angry. In other words, he had this anger towards God. It could also be understood as lachis in ways which made God angry, which would be a little bit easier to understand and would read better. But it could also mean that he did it for the purpose of making God angry. He was angry at God. Why? We don't know. We don't know why Menasheh inherited only the bad parts of his father's personality and not the good parts. We don't know why. It's not clear. It's not understood. One can try to imagine psychologically how he developed this way, but the bottom line is that he did. Vayosem es pesel ha'asherah asher asa, and the image of the Asherah goddess, right, which is some kind of image of a tree, right, that he made. He placed it babayit, within the house, Asher Amar Adonai el David ve'el Shlomo beno, within the house that God had instructed King David and Solomon his son, Babayit hazeh, within this house, uV'Yerushalayim, and in Jerusalem, Asher Bacharti, that I have chosen, Mikol Shiftei Yisrael, from all the tribes of Israel, I have chosen Jerusalem, Asim Eshmi L'olam, that I will place my name forever. Within that house itself, he placed this Asherah image. V'lo osif laha nidregel Yisrael. And God made that promise then that no longer am I going to make the feet of the people of Israel wander min ha'adama, from the land asher nasati lavo, some people that had wandered from Egypt through the desert from place to place until they finally reached here. No longer will I have them wander. Rak, however, only im yishmeru la'asot k'chol asher tzivisem, if they are careful to do the things that I have commanded them. This is the crux, the basis of ethical monotheism. What do I want? I want their behavior, right? And I want them to live according to the teachings that my servant Moses have taught them. This is what I want. If they do that, I will stay here and the people will stay here. However, despite those instructions and despite those promises, v'lo shameu, the people did not listen. Vayat'em Menasheh lasot et Torah, and Menasheh led them on the erroneous path to do terrible evil, Menagayim, even more evil than the nations Asher Hishmir Adonai Mipnei Bnei Yisrael. They were worse even than those nations that God had destroyed in order to bring the people of Israel into the land. Vayidaber Adonai biyad avadav hanviim lemor, and God spoke to his servants, the Nevi'im, the prophets, as follows. Now, we don't know exactly of the death of Yeshayahu, the death of Isaiah. However, traditionally we know it is understood that Menasheh put Isaiah to death because, of course, Isaiah was a threat to him in his idolatrous path. So the tradition has it dated that the prophets of the 12 prophets, the minor prophets, which we did study together on this podcast a couple years back, Joel, Nahum, and Chavakuk were the three prophets who were prophesying at this time, during the time of Menasheh, and they would have been the ones who had received them and their school. Ya'an asher also Menasheh melech Yehuda toivot ha'ela, that because Menasheh, the king of Judah, has done these terrible, abominable things, he has done even worse than the Amorites that preceded the people of Israel in this land. Vayachati gam et Yehuda begilulav, and he led the people of Judah as well into sin through his gilulim, which is often translated as his fetishes. His gilulim are the little idols that people have to use, to pray to worship, and so on. He led the people astray through these things. Lochein, therefore, verse 12, Ko amar Adonai el Yisrael, so says God, the Lord of Israel, Hineni mevi ra'ah al Yerushalayim v'Yehuda, I am going to bring evil upon the city of Jerusalem and the people of Judah, asher kol shoma titzalno shtei oznav, that the evil, the suffering that's going to happen to this people is going to be so bad that people that even hear the news, their ears will shake. V'notisi al Yerushalayim es kav shomron. That measuring stick which I measured out the people of Samaria, right? That kav, which is a measuring tape, like a measuring line. In other words, when I measured out Shomron and I decided to punish them, I'm going to take that same measuring line and roll it over and spread it out over Jerusalem and take judgment on them too. V'et mishkolet beit Achav, and the scales or the weights that I used to weigh out the justice and therefore mete it out against the house of Ahab and destroyed the northern kingdom, I'm going to do the same thing to Jerusalem. Machisi es Yerushalayim, I will erase Jerusalem, kasher yimches atzalachas macha. In the same way, somebody who, after a plate of food is dirty, they wash it clean and turn it upside down to dry. V'afach al poneh, I'm going to do the same thing to Jerusalem. I'm going to clean it out and turn it over to dry. V'notashti, it's just painful to read these words. V'notashti et she'eres nachalasi u'nasati biyad, and the remnant of my inheritance, the remnant of my people, I'm going to give them into the hands of their enemies. V'hayu lavaz v'lim shisol u'chol, and their enemies are going to abuse them and plunder them. This is a prediction of the terrible exile and diaspora that the Jews will suffer after they are expelled from Judah. Yan, and why is this? Because asher asu asara be'enai, they did evil in my eyes. Vayu machisimosi, and they made me angry. Min hayom asher yatsu avosu mitzrayim hayom hazeh. This is a continuous process. No matter how many times things seem to might be getting better, they continuously fall into this repetitive sin. And it's so bad, and you're reading and thinking how awful this curse is, this prophecy is that God is giving his prophets, but the verses emphasize again just how bad and how awful Menasheh is. Don't think it's just a theological mistake, which is bad enough, of worshiping idols, but what does it lead to? It led already. We talked about these child sacrifice. The gamdam naki, this oppression leads to also the killing of innocent people. Shafach Menasheh harbei ma'od. Many innocent people. When there's oppression, when people don't understand that the world was created in order for us to live a moral and ethical life, and they think that the gods need to be appeased and might and power is what rules, oppression is what ensues. Adasher milias Yerushalayim peh la peh. The Jerusalem from one side to the other side was completely full of blood. That's how bad it was. Levad mechataso. This is in addition to the sin asher hachati et Yehuda, that he made Judah sin lasos ra b'nei Adonai, to do evil. It's like saying, in other words, it wasn't just a hachati echataso, meaning that his leading them in the wrong direction in worship of idols, but it was more than that. It was his oppression of human beings, his oppression of innocent people, killing innocent people, making innocent people suffer. This was the nail in the coffin, so to speak, or the straw that broke the camel's back. If it was just a theological sin, it would have been bad, but it wouldn't necessarily have been enough. But if you're going to start killing innocent people, that is going to lead to destruction, and that's going to lead to God's wrath. V'yeser divrei Menasheh v'chol asher asa. And all of the other things about that Menasheh did as king, and the sins that he did, if you want to read about them, go ahead and feel free to read the Chronicles, the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah. Vayishkav Menasheh mavosav, and Menasheh died. V'yikaver began beso began Uzzah, and he was buried in his palace, in the garden of his palace in Gan Uzzah. Vayimloch Amon beno tachtav, and Amon his son took rule over him. for whatever reason, Menashe was not buried together with the the kings of Judah as before. Whether that was on his own thing, it's not related here. Now, the fact that Menashe had a change of heart at the end of his life, and his repentance, and how that came about, and so on, that, as I said, is not mentioned here in the book of Kings. It's only mentioned in the book of Chronicles, and in our tradition throughout Chazal it's discussed. But because we're learning the book of Kings, I wanted to present Menashe as he is presented here, as all evil. I mean, all agree that Menashe's career was extremely evil and brought the people to the depths of depravity. However, the small possible saving grace, so to speak, at the end of his life is discussed in other places. It's painful to read, but it's what we have to read. It's what we're studying. Thank you so much for studying this together. Looking forward to completing the chapter 21 and reading about the career of Menashe's son Amon together in the next podcast. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.